Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Authors at Google event. It is my privilege to welcome Bernard-Henri Lévy, who is a philosopher, journalist, activist, and filmmaker. He is the co-founder of the anti-racist group SOS Racism and has served on diplomatic missions for the French government. He has written dozens of books. His films include the documentaries Bosna and A Day in the Death of Sarajevo. Today he will talk about his latest book, Left in Dark Times, A Stand Against the New Barbarism. His writing has appeared in a wide range of publications throughout Europe and the United States. Following the talk, we will have a Q&A session. When we do, remember our remote audience and please use the microphone when asking a question. And now it is my honor to introduce Bernard-Henri Lévy.
Is a little too much for me. I'm not a diplomat. I'm a free thinker, a free spirit, a free man, never devoted to any government, even mine. And I did not do that. I did that once. After September 11, a few weeks after September 11, I accepted for once in my lifetime a mission in Afghanistan, which was given by the French President, rightist Chirac, and the French Prime Minister, leftist Jospin. They asked me to go and spend a few months, a few weeks in Afghanistan in order to see what the situation was, what the needs were, and what France and Europe could be in order to help. So it is not missions as if I were a diplomat. I'm the contrary of that. I have no diplomatic language. I have no diplomatic manners, and I'm not at all a diplomat. It's so true that when the book we are here to comment, Left in Dark Times, starts with a very undiplomatical conversation with a man who was about to become, a few weeks after, the new president of France, who was at this time sort of, I would not say sort of a friend, but sort of a buddy, of a comrade, and whose name was Nicolas Sarkozy. He calls me. We are in February 2007. France is a strange country, you might think, where a future president calls a writer to ask him to endorse him. It's a fact. This is one of the peculiarities of my very peculiar country. So he does that. He calls me, and calls me in order to ask my support in the battle which he is waging and which he is going to win. He asked me that in a very undiplomatic way, with terrible words which are translated more or less, but the English language is so Puritan that I'm not sure that the words of Nicolas Sarkozy are translated as they should have been. Very raw and rough language. I answer on the same tone. And the conversation is, this undiplomatical conversation has for theme, for topic, when do you come and support me? You pretend you are on the left, you, Bernard-Henri Lévy, but what does it mean? Left does not exist any longer. The liberals have dishonored themselves in so many circumstances. They are discarded by the very history itself. So what are you faithful to? You are faithful to a ghost of your past, a ghost of your youth whatsoever, but a ghost. One cannot be faithful to a ghost, so join me. And I hang up the phone after a long conversation with two contradictory, apparently contradictory, in fact, complementary feelings. Feeling number one, I will not vote for Sarkozy. Feeling number two, he is not completely wrong in his diagnosis, in his appreciation of the state of affairs of my left. I will not vote for Sarkozy, first part of the book, because I am a leftist. What does it mean to be a leftist? What sense these words still have in France, in Europe, in America? This book is devoted to America as much as to Europe. Sorry, but since Who Killed Daniel Pearl and since American Vertigo, I feel by a part of myself, half of my heart, quarter of my brain, I feel a little devoted to this country, taking part in its political battles, really involved and concerned by the presidential race between Mr. Obama and Mrs. Pauline. Mr. McCain is already out of the frame. So the first part of the book is devoted to try to answer to the question what being a liberal means. What is it nowadays, 21st century, in America and in Europe? Attempt to reply to this question, the question of the human rights, the question of the combination between freedom and equality, the question of the universality of a certain body of values, the question of the internationalism, which I believe belong to the inheritage of the left, the side, the illiberal, being much more nationalist, the ethnicist, and so on. This is the first part of the book. Sarkozy leaves me with the bitter feeling that there is something wrong about all that he told me, and that in spite of friendship, in spite of all the good I think of him, in spite of the good man he is, I will remain on the left. Why? Second part of the book is devoted to recognize that even more unfortunately, I might vote for the left, but he's right. He's not the right, he's right. He's right when saying that there is really something corrupted, something rotten in the kingdom of not of Denmark, but of the left. And when I go across the big issues which the left in America, in Europe did miss, if I go across some of the mistakes the liberals have done and are still doing in America like in Europe, I must admit that the field of the left is a field of ruins. I don't know yet that when my book will be released, America will face such a huge, unpredictable economical crisis. I don't know yet that this country, which lessons since decades all the rest of the world about how an economy should be governed and so on, is going to face this situation which 1 week ago put him at the quasi-level of a huge Argentina. But of course I don't know it, but there are some parts of the books where I don't predict that, certainly not, but I set the system of questions, of replies, of topics which lead to that. The question of regulations and non-regulations, the question of what a free market is, the question of under which conditions the free market, which is the only way of ruling an economy, can be something else than the kingdom of the greed and of the enrichment of a minority and so on. All that is in Left in Dark Times, written 1 year ago. And on other questions, which are not specially devoted to America. And about that, I must admit, that's what I wanted to say, I must admit that even if Barack Obama is personally my champion, even if 4 years ago, before Left in Dark Times, I met the young Barack Obama. We spent some time together, and I wrote a piece in the American press and in the French one entitled A Black Clinton, which means that 4 years ago, I foresaw that this guy, because of his charisma, because of his intellectual sharpness, his smartness, his grace, and so on, had the shoulders and had the mind and had the stature to become a president of the United States. I had to admit that he was very strangely ill-equipped if he happened to have to face a situation like the one which America has to face today. Lack of work, lack of ideological process, lack of conceptual enterprise, you may name it the way you want. The left in America, exactly as in Europe, facing such critical situation as the one you have to face today, is really in bad shape and in dark times. On other sort of topics, I think the same and even worse. When I take one by one, which are according to me, the grand criteria, the big topics which characterize the liberal, which are the core of their identity, I have to admit that in our two countries, they often deny this principle. Supposed to be internationalist, I think that the internationalism is going backward today and that we have a return of the spirit of nationalism on the left side as much as on the right side. Universality of human rights, even worse. We have a left which, in America like in Europe, believes less and less in this universality, and which more and more believes in name of multiculturalism, in name of moral relativism, in name of political correctness, whatsoever, but who less and less believes that the same rights should be deserved by, should be applied to all sorts of population. And we have a left who is more and more inclined to say and to think that, for example, to demand the strict respect of the principle of equality between women and men is a duty in America and is a racist act in, for example, an Arab country. We have a lot more and more leftists, liberals who, in name of anti-racism, and you were told that I'm the founder in Europe of a big anti-racist organization, but I have to admit that anti-racism have today, like many things, of course, some sort of side effect, counter effects when led to its ultimate consequences. One of these effects being that if we demand in Pakistan or in Afghanistan or in Algeria or in Egypt the strict respect of this equality between men and women, which we find be a duty in America or in France, it suddenly becomes not a duty but an act of intolerance addressed to the peculiar landscape, to the archaic culture of the concerned country where women should be veiled, men should have the right to stone them alive if they look at a man who is not their husband, and so on and so on. This strange denaturation of the spirit of tolerance this strange denaturation of the spirit, the great spirit, of the multiculturalism, of the necessary diversity of the world, turning to be the principle of a double standard regarding values according to the place where one is born, is another of the big betrayals of the left. Another example, before going to the questions, Q&A. Another example on which I insist, there are many more. There is a chapter about anti-Semitism, which is important. There is a chapter about the very strange attitude of the left, who is, thanks God, so vigilant, so awakened, in order to ask to any people in the world some accounts regarding the past fascism. There is an accountability on fascism which is demanded to the Germans, thanks God. There is an accountability demanded to the French, that's great. In America, where there was never a victorious fascism, but a fascist temptation, America first, Lindbergh, all that. There is a right manner to say to the Americans, you should look that in face. Ku Klux Klan, you should not ignore this part of your history. You have to make the mourning of it. If you don't do the mourning of this fascist part of your history, you would never be alive again. That's great. But what is less great is that when the question arises, when the question of the past fascism happens to concern not America, not France, not Germany, not Italy, not Romania, but Arab countries, suddenly uneasiness, silence, not a word. You should not speak of that. It is not exactly the same. They are not really responsible. They did not mean it. It was just a sort of fake imitation of what happened in Europe. Usually it was an effect of the humiliation and the misery of this part of the world. They should not be applied the same principle of accountability. This again. This idea that you have some peoples who should be accountable and some unaccountable of this fact of the 20th century, which was the fascism, for me, is expressed under the flag of the tolerance. In reality, the result of that is to consider some peoples in a racist way. If one really believes that the fact of having having had some black shirts, some Nazi uniforms in the street of Cairo does not have any meaning, and that it should have in France, it is a racist way of thinking. It is not a liberal way of thinking history, and it is the worst service we can give. It is the worst way we can treat the Democrats, the human rights activists, the women fighting for freedom in the Cairo of today, for example. So again, a left which, under the behalf of the respect of the other, under the behalf of non-reproducing at any cost, at any price, the bad attitudes of colonialism of yesterday, produces a sort of neo-racism, strange and terrible dialectics. And the last example I would quote, there are many others in the book. Last example I will quote today is about Darfur. I know that in San Francisco there was a great concern all the past years, movements of activists in favor of Darfur. Unfortunately, we have in America and we have in Europe other groups, very numerous too, recognizing themselves in the left and who believe that Darfur is not such a deal. Why? According to which dialectic? I think that there is, in the liberal camp of today, a machinery, an ideological motor or engine which makes us blind and deaf to some of the miseries of the world, like Darfur, and who make the left being blind and deaf to the duty which should be her duty, and which is the duty of support of victims, whatever they are. What is this machinery? What is it that in the liberal camp, in the left, make some deaf and blind to some bloodbaths, to some genocides, to some suffering? Answer: anti-Americanism, anti-so-called imperialism. I explain that at length in the book. I explain how anti-imperialism, which was a great thing when the problem was to dismantle some of the biggest empires known in the modern history, the French one, the English one, the Soviet one, which was an empire. Today, applied to the history of now, in the best case, does not mean any longer anything. To say America is an empire does not mean anything. It just means that you don't give yourself the real tools to criticize America when America does bad, and when America commits faults and mistakes, which it does, especially under certain administrations. But to put that under the flag, the black flag of anti-imperialism, is just crazy. America is not an empire. An empire does not try desperately to build a national army, to go out of the place as quick as possible, and so on. This is not an empire. But number two, this thematic, this topic, this way of thinking through the concepts of empire and anti-empire, this great narrative, this great story, as they say, Bill O'Reilly on Fox News, great story, this big story, which is supposed to oppose two big camps, the camp of the empire on one side, the camp of the anti-empire on the other side. America, England, and Israel on one side. Ahmadinejad, Hugo Chavez, and Castro on the other side. The fact of building between the two the narrative of a gigantic opposition, a military version of the Carpaccio painting, Saint George and the Dragoon. Saint George and the Dragoon. Saint George being Ahmadinejad and Chavez, Dragoon being America and Israel. This way of framing the world has just the terrible effect, unforgivable, to let fall, to drop flat, to put out of the frame a lot of conflicts. The majority of the suffering of today, who have just one problem, they are out of frame. They have nothing to do with this great narrative. What does it happen to you in the narrative of the left of today if you are, for example, a Tutsi of Rwanda, killed by hundreds of thousands because you have in front of you some crazy guys believing in Hutu power? What happens to you? You are not on the American side. You are not on the anti-empire. You are nowhere. You don't exist. Nobody takes care. What does it happen to you when you deal with leftists and liberals who say that it is a task of these days to support the humiliated, offended, oppressed Muslim populations? Great principle. I sign, I agree. But what happens to you when you belong to a Muslim population which is the Muslim population of Chechnya, or the Muslim population 15 years ago of Bosnia-Herzegovina? What happens to you? In other words, if you are not Palestinian. If you are Palestinian, you have in front of you the devilish, horrible, full of evil America. You are a hero. Even if when you count your deaths, you count a few thousand, which is huge, of course. You are the salt of the earth. But when you count your death in hundreds of thousands, like in Chechnya, and that you have not in front of you America, but Putin, the new mafioso regime of Russia, out of frame. No demonstrations, no flags in the streets, no screaming in front of White House, and so on. So a machinery, which is the anti-American machinery, the anti-imperialist machinery, which belongs to the patrimonial, to the left of today, exactly as the Marxism belonged to her yesterday, and which has the effect to make it blind and to make her, the left, deny what should be her mission, which is to support the victims, to help them as much as she can and wherever they are. These are more or less some of the topics of Left in Dark Times. Not only that, it is also an intellectual biography of my generation. It is also a history in modern ages of the concept of revolution. It is also a narrative of how and why the so-called Marxism-Leninism have disappeared from our landscape and horizon. But it's also few of the topics which I briefly evoked till now. So now, Q&A. We have 25 minutes, I think. That is?
Hi, thanks for that. To the extent that that the left has fallen into this sort of anti-imperial, anti-America sort of rut that you describe, what do you think is behind that? I mean, for example, people who live here in America who may find themselves rooting for Chavez against the imperialist Americans or something like that. What do you think is behind that?
Hatred of democracy, hatred of liberty. You can believe what you want about Bush, and I think I will believe worse as any of you believe. The only point is that in 47 days he will be out of office. And maybe out of office to leave the place to a man named Barack Obama. That's America. Not only America, that's democracy. Chavez, as far as I know, he will be there like Castro all his lifetime. Like Kim Il-jong in Korea. He can become crazy, he can lose his mind, he can lose his means of governing, he will be there. With repression on the press, with repression on the unions, with anti-Semitic speeches openly expressed, and so on. So those who prefer Chavez to any president of America, including Bush, are just people who prefer strength, machismo democracy, autocracy, machismo democracy, than our weak, paradoxical, complicated, sophisticated, but great and vibrant democracies. That's what they believe. But it's their problem, not mine. For me, between Chavez and the Democrats, no point, no choice, no choice. I prefer the worst of the Democrats. For example, let's say Bush, okay, than an autocrat, a despot like Chavez.
I think that's an interesting characterization because, as you say, the sort of the democratic model has this sort of weak executive as opposed to the autocrat, and yet when I think of sort of the archetype of the anti-American demonstrator who lives in the United States, it's kind of the Berkeley hippie, don't want to hurt anybody sort of thing, whereas the sort of more strong machismo type of people I see around me, they tend to be more pro-American. So it seems this kind of encounter to their own personal life.
They don't want to hurt anybody, but they hurt. When they say, for example, we don't want to hurt the Pakistanis culture, we don't want to hurt. They are what they are. They have their customs, they have their history, they have their culture. We should not hurt. We should not, we, American, with our strong principle, our Coca-Cola, our Google, and so on, we should not hurt this sophisticated, complicated, well-balanced, and fragile culture of Pakistan. We should not hurt. The problem is that are really hurted the women which are not stoned but burnt alive in Pakistan every day, even in spite of the law which was passed 2 years ago by Musharraf, because they dared to look in the eyes a man who was not their husband. So with our comfort, not wanting to hurt the general principle of a foreign culture, we accept the silent hurting in the countryside, out of our sight, of course, of hundreds, thousands, maybe more, young women condemned to death because they are considered to be unequal to the men. I'm sorry, not hurting the civilization, what does it mean when the civilization of which we are speaking is a civilization which has a great quality, a big number of great qualities. I know Pakistan, great country, true, with some great cultural aspects, exact, with a lot of things which should be deserved to be imitated here in America, absolutely. But with also this idea which denies not the principle of America, but the principle of mankind, that mankind is divided into two: real human beings who are the men, and perturbators elements of perturbation, not human beings, which are the women. Why are the women veiled or encaged in these burqas? Because they are considered as being either a body reproducing the gender, either a perturbating element which has to be hidden. I'm sorry. I do believe that it is possible to live in a peaceful place where women with their beautiful face are considered as human beings, not as perturbating elements which should be absolutely be enclosed, encaged, and hidden. Nevertheless, it is what the left, more and more often, in academic circles, in big public opinion, in America, as in Europe, believes more and more. And there is a real protest, a real trial, which has to be made on that. In the name of the left, I feel, as for myself, maybe you too, I feel the need and the duty to say to these people that they turn the back, that they deny the dearest of their own principles. They betray the true spirit of the liberals.
Were there ever bright times for the left?
I'm sorry?
Were there ever bright times, non-dark times for the left? Because wasn't it always a tension between idealism and realism?
The question is not idealism and realism. I am in favor of this tension. I am not an idealist. I am not stupid enough to believe in angelism. I believe that the true politics mixes the two, idealism and realism. I don't believe, for example, that, that democracy, the neocons were idealists, maybe, apparently, and maybe in reality, completely realist. They were 100% idealistic, 100% realistic. Good combination. I am not. I am idealistic in a way, but I know that you have to compose with the reality. This is no point. You cannot, for example, I was in Georgia recently, in BDC. I knew that America and Europe could not make war all of a sudden in favor of the Georgian democracy. Of course, I'm not idealistic enough to believe that. But not to be idealistic should not prevent you from saying the things and from saying them properly, in true terms. And the biggest sin against the mind, against the spirit, might be for what is bad to say good. Might be for what is crime to say necessity. And it is a crime because doing that, you offend, really, the victims of the crime, but also those who wait from you real support and who are properly despaired.
But that's not exactly new, right? Like the French left
of
and
course not.
like Stalinist Russia was...
Exactly. But what is new? What is new is that my generation, and the book tells that in the first 50 pages, we believed that we really kicked out, we really got rid of an old temptation of the left, the so-called Marxism-Leninism. The idea was that this old narrative was definitely out. And it is true. It is true that something happened between the 70s and the fall of the wall of Berlin, and between the two, an event which is seldom quoted, but to which I devote a big part of the book, for a chapter, which is a revolution in Cambodia. Something happened in all that which meant the discarding of the old Marxist-Leninist revolutionary left. It is an ancient story, but we got rid of it. And one could think, I did not, but some could think, that after 1989, when you were born, more or less, after 1989, after the fall of the wall of Berlin, a new age could begin for the left. A new age devoid of, getting rid of the old temptations and the old criminal attitudes. One could believe that the left could enter in the sure path, correct road of real, taking care of the real people, reform, improving the life of the average, building some real healthcare system in countries, a little rearguard like America. One believed that. It did not happen because the history of the ideas has her to horror of the emptiness. And when you have an emptiness, a hole left by the Marxism, something replaces. And my book is devoted to understand, to depict what replaced in the minds this ruined, let's say, Marxism-Leninism.
So I have a question I make a point of asking all our political and journalistic guests, so you're not the first. It's often said that the US won the Cold War. So do you agree or disagree? And if so, why?
I think that the end of the Cold War was a joint victory, a joint venture. Between who? Joint between who? To say it in a paradoxal and provocative way, I will say, those who won the Cold War, the joint venture winning it, is Pentagon plus Solzhenitsyn. Pentagon plus Solzhenitsyn. The biggest military power in the earth and one of the greatest writers in the world. Strangely enough, it is this combination which won the Cold War. This is to say it in a provocative way, even, of course, it is more complicated. It is not only Pentagon, it is also the public opinion in America, it is also Europe. Then it is not only Solzhenitsyn, it is all the dissidents of Eastern and Central Europe who won that with Solzhenitsyn, but it is the two forces. If you had only the sword, the sabre, the sword, would not have been enough. You had to have also the spirit. You had also to have the spiritual revolution embodied by some writers and free thinkers. This was the miracle of the... And you have a third force, joint venture between Pentagon, Solzhenitsyn, and suicide. And self-suicide. Suicide of Soviet Union by Soviet Union. There was something as a suicide too. And suicide, it is like in a private life. When you have somebody close to you who commits suicide, very hard to know why. Even if you find, generally you don't find a letter, generally, explaining the reasons. And even if you find, it is generally not the truth. So suicide plus Pentagon plus Solzhenitsyn.
So I think it's pretty fair what you say about the left abandoning, for the most part, perhaps it's optimistic to say that Marxism-Leninism is completely gone, but it's been abandoned to a large extent, and I think the thesis that it's been replaced with the imperialism, anti-imperialism frame is interesting. And it's a frame that you seem to repudiate, but the interesting thing about Marxism-Leninism, certainly, and possibly the other frame, is that it presented a clear vision. And perhaps the vision was flawed, but it presented a vision of how a perfect world should be. It was a utopia that was posited. Wondering what your thoughts are on what replaces it. So we throw out the Marxism-Leninism, we remove the last remnants, we throw out the imperialism, anti-imperialism meme. Where is and what is the clear vision of the way that the world should be that should be espoused by the left to fill that vacuum?
You are right about Marxism, half right. Marxism was not only a utopia. The real Marxism of Das Kapital, was not utopia, was a sort of a science. And when you read Capital, you had some tools of knowledge, you had some concepts which really helped you to understand the world. And still now, I am the author 30 years ago of a Barbarism, the Human Face, devoting to explain how Marxism could be a school of slavery and so on, but till now, I believe that if you want to understand what is happening today between Lehman Brothers, Goldman, Bidule, Merrill, Truc, and so on, Capital of Marx might be not unuseful. Capital disappearing, Marxism disappearing, you have a new landscape where theory is replaced by conspiracy philosophy. The vacuum has been filled by magic, esoteric explanations, plot hypothesis, and conspiracy philosophy, which is the worst. We are in this moment now. The former Marxists have become specialists of plot philosophy, which is another aspect of this betrayal I was speaking to you before. Now, where is the left, the genuine liberalism which could be, should be opposed to the dead Marxism and to the stupid conspiracism or plotism which replaced? Part of it is in the past, in the American, English, French, reformist, trade unionist, social democrat tradition, and part of it has to be built. The work is in front of us, all of us. The work is in front. Things don't come at a glance. Only the neocons believe that it is enough to send some troops in Iraq in order to have in one day democracy all dressed, all armed, going out of the leg of Jupiter like a goddess. No. Build a democracy, build an alternative to plot theory or Marxism needs time, needs patience, needs work. We are a few in Europe, in America, to try to devote to that. Join the club, wherever you are, and wherever you will be after your years in Google. Last question. Two last.
On that same note, you were describing the neocon movement and our forays into Iraq and Afghanistan, and you're also describing how it requires patience, and obviously the nation-building model in which we toppled a dictatorship and replaced it with arguably chaos didn't work. So I was wondering, how would you go about building a democracy?
How what?
How would you go about building a democracy in a place where there is none?
Problem is not me. You have some people. Wait a minute. Democracy is not an exotic product completely unknown to the Islamic peoples. The famous Enlightenment, the separation between the divine law and the secular law, the separation between the two reigns, the reigns in the sky and the reign on the earth. Before Voltaire, before John Locke, before Thomas Paine, before whoever, you had great Muslim thinkers like Averroes who did that. The first enlighters, the first theoreticians of enlightenment were Arabs and Muslims. We are not speaking of something we are going to build out of nothing in countries who did not know the slightest whiff of it. Even if it was, we should try, by the way. Because human rights, the right for a body not to be cut into pieces, sliced in pieces, the right for a soul not to be put into slavery, I think it's better than the contrary. But it is not a fact. The Arab countries have some secular, some democratic, some free spirit traditions. And not only they have the tradition, but they have some currents today, some trends of opinion, some big movements, sometimes silent, of course, because they are like us. They are afraid. We are afraid. We are afraid. We Westerners, European and American, we are afraid. Afraid to republish the cartoons of Netherlands because we are afraid of the reactions. We are afraid of, for example, of that. So they are afraid, the moderates in Islam. And they are silent, as always the moderates are silent in any country. Here in America, Mr. Farrakhan, who does not represent a lot, but Mr. Who surely does not represent the African-American community, shouts a lot. The Reverend Wright shouts a lot. The extremists shout always more than the moderate, but it does not mean that the moderates don't exist. So how to build a democracy in the Arab world? By supporting those who want it and who are much more numerous. Believe me, I'm a great traveler. I went in many of these places. I spent some of my time. You have the people, much more than we had people resisting the Soviet Empire inside Soviet Union at the time of the Cold War. So what we did for the handful of dissidents in Soviet Union, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and so on, what we did, what you did, American, for the handful of free spirit, we should do it for the huge number of free spirit existing in Pakistan, in Syria, in Egypt, in Jordan, maybe in Saudi Arabia. I don't know, I never went, but I suppose. In Iran, this I'm sure. You have really a huge part of the population who believe that Ahmadinejad is the worst news who happened to them since ages. So how do I do? Helping these guys, helping these women.
I very much liked your presentation, but I couldn't help from thinking, why is this dichotomy to preserve left and right is even necessary? As you have said on your own, the banner of the left is being picked up by some scoundrels and some rogue states and some basically political and ideological hooligans of sorts. The flag of the right is being carried by professionals who don't want to deal with everybody else and who much rather would run their own project. And as a result, don't you think that there is just one big effort to create the major world ghetto where you would have a gated community with clean air, clean water, efficient democratic politics, and everybody else? I mean, how much news there was about Rwandan genocide in here? Half of the country was listening to the domestic news channels, probably. And to sort of take your own example about the voice of oppressed Arabs, for instance, yes, there is a media platform for oppressed Arabs, say, in Palestine, but how much of the Arabic voice from the states of Qatar or states of Oman do we hear, who are much better off than probably a lot of Americans are? So I wanted to solicit your opinion about that.
You are right, it's a question, and you are speaking, and it is, I'm not joking. I'm not joking because it put me at the moment in an abyss of reflection. You are speaking like Sarkozy in this conversation. No, really, no, but why not? What does left and right mean? What does it mean? Why should we be faithful to one or the other? Why should not the men and women of goodwill join, etc.? It's a possibility. I don't exclude it. It is part of the book, of the process of my internal whisper in my mind when I begin this book. It's true. Nevertheless, I believe it's better to keep that because it means the movement, of the history of ideas, the debate of opinions depends on some very old clays of significancy. Right and left, they are full of history, full of memories, full of living and dead names, and so on. It is like families. So it is like life, right and left. It's like Democratic and Republican Party at the end of the day. In the Republican Party, you have some progressive. In the Democratic Party, you have some conservatives. A Democrat of the South is often more reactionary than the former mayor of New York, Ed Koch, who is supporting Bush, but who is a Democrat. Or maybe he's a Republican now, but a progressive Republican close to Hillary Clinton, but supporting Bush. So, of course, left and right, let's say, It is like the Democratic Party and the GOP, the Great Old Party, the Republican Party in America. It is a dividing line, but it is not the only one. You have some dividing lines which divide these ones and which complicated them. You have to take all that into account in order to have the most vivid, vibrant debate as possible. Thank you.